linguagem, mente e natureza. Estes são alguns temas discutidos pelo psicólogo Steven Pinker no ciclo de conferências Fronteiras do Pensamento. O canadense é também escritor, professor e linguista, e sua obra busca compreender como ocorre a aquisição da linguagem. Acompanhe agora a primeira parte dessa conferência.
So let me start with a rather big question. How does the mind work? The great puzzle of the mind is that in many ways the human mind is an engineering masterpiece. No man-made device like a robot or computer can see, move, speak and understand, or use common sense nearly as well as a person. You can't go to an electronics store now and buy a robot that would help you at home by putting away the dishes or running simple errands. And that's because the everyday feats that we take for granted, that our brain just solves without us even thinking, are formidably difficult engineering feats which have never been duplicated in human-made software. But there is a paradox. For all of the engineering complexity in the human mind, it is also subject to some strange, puzzling quirks, apparent defects. For example, why is the thought of eating worms disgusting? It's a perfectly nutritious form of animal protein. Why does the male of our species do mad deeds, such as challenge each other to duels or murder their ex-wives? And why do people everywhere believe in ghosts and spirits? Why do fools fall in love? There's an endless set of mysteries about the mind which are surprising given how well engineered the mind appears to be. Well, I suggested in the book, How the Mind Works, that the way to answer both of those questions is to understand the mind the way we understand any complex device. Now, in forward engineering, you know what you want your device to accomplish, and you go out and you design the device to do it. Reverse engineering is the opposite. You find a device and you try to figure out what it was designed to do. So reverse engineering is what the technicians at Panasonic do when Sony comes out with a new product. They go to the store, buy one, take it back to the lab, take a screwdriver to it, and try to figure out what all of the gears and chips and springs are for. Now, bodies are complex devices. For example, the human eye is far more complex than a gadget that you would buy at an electronics store. And for hundreds of years, the science of anatomy and physiology consist of trying to reverse engineer the parts of the body. Now, of course, in the case of the body, we don't think that there literally was a cosmic engineer who designed all of our body parts, but we explain the appearance or illusion of design by appealing to Darwin's theory of evolution. The only scientific explanation that we have for how signs of design can appear in the natural world. Now, the mind is a complex device, like the body, like an electronic gadget. If you don't believe me, a simple proof is that we don't have robots that can do what a human mind can do. And that suggests that my own field, psychology, is a kind of reverse engineering. And the first question you have to ask in reverse engineering is, what is its function? In the case of humans, the ultimate answer from Darwin is that the ultimate function of the mind is survival and reproduction in the environment in which the mind evolved, and that would mean the foraging or hunter-gatherer environment that characterized our species for hundreds of thousands of years until the very recent invention of agriculture and civilization and cities just 10,000 years ago. Now, the brain has evolved many tricks for recovering three-dimensional shapes from the two-dimensional retinal image. And I'll talk about one of them called shape from shading. The shape from shading computation in our head relies on a law of physics. basically, the shallower the angle of a surface, the less light it reflects. Let me show you. If I have a light source that is pointing directly onto a surface, then it forms a nice, bright, concentrated spot of light. But now, if the surface is tilted with respect to the light source, the light is smeared over a much bigger area, and so any particular spot on the surface will be much dimmer. Now, what our brains do is they work backwards from this law and compute that the dimmer a spot on the surface, the shallower the angle of that surface in the world. And therefore, the brain can reconstruct a shape from the thousands of lightness values, each of which is used to interpret the orientation of that bit of surface in the world. But in doing that, the brain is making an assumption. It's assuming that the world looks like this, a uniformly or randomly colored surface, and it has to make that assumption so that it can interpret the brightness of a patch as the angle of a surface. If you had a surface that was colored with different amounts of pigment in clever ways, it would fool our shape from shading module and make us hallucinate things that aren't actually in the world. Well, this is not just an abstract theoretical prediction, but it happens all the time. For example, television. Why do so many people spend 4 hours a day looking at a piece of glass in front of a box? Well, the reason is that that piece of glass and the box have been engineered to display a very non-uniform pattern of light and dark across the surface of the glass. Our brain, assuming that the surface is uniform, hallucinates a three-dimensional world behind the screen, and hence we entertain ourselves by looking at this piece of glass. But another example is makeup. Women who are skilled at applying makeup know that if you put some rouge on the sides of the cheek or the sides of the nose, the shape from shading analyzer in the brain will interpret a darker patch as a steeper angle, and that will make the nose appear smaller. Conversely, if you put some light powder on the upper lip, the brain will interpret that as a shallower angle, and that gives the big bee-stung full lips that the supermodels all strive for. But I mention these examples to make a more general point, which is that many illusions and fallacies and maladaptive behaviors that we find in the human mind may not be design defects, but might instead come from a mismatch between the assumptions about an ancestral world that are built into our mental faculties and the structure of the current world, such as the difference between the uniform surface assumed by our shape from shading analyzer and the modern inventions of television and makeup. So to answer puzzles like why do people eat junk food? Why do so many people eat themselves to an early grave with a diet that is too rich in sugar and salt and fat? Why do people use contraception, which from a Darwinian point of view is a kind of suicide? You're taking steps to prevent your genes from replicating instead of encouraging your genes to replicate. And why do people gamble? If the casino makes a profit, then the players, on average, must lose. Well, a possible answer is that our emotions and our drives evolved in a world in which sweet foods are nutritious, and that was true in the world we evolved in which the only sweet foods were ripe fruit, true until the recent invention of food manufacturing, which can churn out massive quantities of sugar. It assumes a world in which sex leads to babies, and that was true until the recent invention of effective contraception. So by installing sexual desire into organisms, the babies used to come automatically, no longer. And a world in which statistical patterns have underlying causes, which is true of everywhere in the world except for devices that are manufactured to display random patterns, such as roulette wheels and slot machines and decks of cards and the other tricks in a gambling establishment.